Hi, everyone. Well, I'm here with Dan Anderson, who heads up the Lachlan Macquarie Institute. And in a few weeks' time, we have Kategoria, a great event that's coming up. Dan, explain to us a little bit about Kategoria and the reasons behind it.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. It's really good to be with you. Kategoria is a title that we basically blatantly ripped off an old journal that used to be run by Philip Jensen and the
Remember
crew
it?
at USW, yeah, Matthias Media. And Philip's explanation of the title Kategoria was that it was the opposite of apologia. So if you think about apologetics as giving a defense of something, and when Christians want to give a defense of the faith, they engage in apologetics. Categorics is to go on the question, to actually ask the question of the other side. And it does have a kind of a use in kind of Greek kind of legal rhetoric as the sort of prosecuting the case. And so we're trying to think through a little bit about what are the questions that we want to be asking of the society around us, and what sorts of questions do Christians pose to our society, not just defending what we believe, but actually taking what we believe and using it instrumentally to think about how to envisage and imagine better kinds of societies.
Yeah, look, this year's is, I would say, humbly based around a certain book called Future Proof, which I wrote, which deals with the Christian in the public square issues. But the way LMI has widened it really brings in some of the experts in the areas that we are trying to, as Christians, push in and ask questions about in the public square and pitch a vision of what society could look like. Why is that important at the current time to deal with those questions?
Yeah, I think what we're seeking to do is each time we have category, we want to have a central set of ideas that we're working around, and we're really looking forward to doing the kind of future proofing stuff. But if you want to make that active, if you want to kind of operationalize it, you need to actually take it down to the level of particular areas and forms of engagement with our society. And what we're doing at the rest of Categoria is trying to give a bit of a map of the terrain on which we work as Christians, in which our churches live, as pastors, as we seek to minister and engage to each other. What is the actual map of the terrain? What are the key areas of culture that we're engaged in? So we're thinking a little bit about work and politics, we're thinking about sport, we're thinking about media, and we're getting professionals who work in those areas to come and give us their take on what are the key dynamics of that kind of cultural area. And then we're workshopping together to think through, okay, well, as a Christian, what does a creative, faithful, questioning, imaginative response look like in that space?
Yes, and look, with the word terrain is interesting because it's one thing to know your terrain, but when it starts to move in a seismic way, that's some of the issues we're dealing with, the anxiety issues around some of the big cultural topics and legislative topics, political topics. Uh, how how does Christianity lean into the shifting terrain, do you think, in it? How does it do it best?
Yeah, the kind of, I think, unexamined reality of the kind of social moment that we live in some to some extent is the function of the rate of change and the mass scale. If you just do those kind of classic graphs of change over the course of the 20th century, and the sort of hockey stick graphs that show growth of population and growth of energy consumption and growth of education, all of these things. And so we're living in a society which is experiencing rates of change that no other human society's ever had to kind of cope with at a scale that no society's ever had to cope with. And so that's challenging. It's not just challenging for Christians, it's challenging for everyone. Um, how do we deal with that? In some ways, the answer there is not particularly like immediately theological, and then it is, right? Like how we deal with it is by listening and working with each other. Like none of us are capable of dealing with those kinds of rates of change or mass scale as individuals. What we do is we learn from each other. We look and see how other people are going. Um, and then what we do, I guess, and this is where the theological part of it comes in, is that we actually start to kind of ask those questions together back of our foundational resources. We go back to scripture and we go back to prayer. We know that even in these rates of change and mass scale, even if no one in the world has had to kind of live in these sorts of societies before, we know that God knew that, and that he equipped his church to live in those times with the gospel and with his word. And so as we kind of go out, or we bring in people from the various parts of the terrain and we say, hey, what's changing out there? We also sit together around God's word and we think, well, what has God already prepared us to be able to do in this moment? And that's the sort of dynamic that I think we look to. Yeah.
And who would you be encouraging to come along to Kategoria? Because it's going to be an intellectual issue, but it's not just intellectual. We want to see that go into the public square, and it's not abstract. It's something practical. Who are the kind of people that would benefit from Kategoria?
The best way that you actually solve some of these complicated problems is by creating a really um, effective model of the world, right? But that model of the world doesn't live in the head of one person, except for maybe you, Steve. Maybe it lives in your head. But, but but my experience is actually, and I've tried this. I'm a philosopher by training. I spent all my life trying to build mental models that are sophisticated enough to describe reality. You can't do it. What you can do is you can create a network of people who are all kind of nodes within that kind of social system. But the more effective the network, then it becomes more effective when it's actually got people from really diverse places and backgrounds. So we're not actually going to be very good at thinking about the problems that we face and the opportunities that we face as Christians if everyone in the room thinking about that are kind of law students from Sydney or housewives from Perth. Like what you actually need are a range of different kinds of people. We want to be in a place where we can have really fruitful and they will be intellectual conversations, but we try to translate them in terms that are going to be understandable for each other. And the thing that I've loved about Kategoria in the past, when we ran it last year, we had people who were coming from Alice Springs, who are Sparkies. We have really senior public servants and lawyers, people who have very impressive academic credentials, through to people who are just interested. But actually, we create a space where everyone is able to feed in. This is the bit of the terrain I stand on and what I'm seeing, and we can learn from each other and grow out of that. So, I mean, that's a very long-winded way of saying, hey, just about anyone can come to this and we'll get something out of it.
Yeah, and that's probably what I am appreciating about the Kategoria model is that it isn't rarefied air. It's on the ground. What does this look like? How does it affect us as Christians? How does it help us live the tension of the Christian life in this age? And yeah, and those sorts of things.
This is
And
kind of the great strength of the church, right? And it still is. We're losing this because our churches get more and more sorted. But historically, what's so remarkable about a church is you walk in and it's full of a really diverse range of people who have no other reason for being in that room other than Jesus. But even just at the level of kind of social science and sociality, that diversity is a real resource for the church. It means that we are bringing people from all those different backgrounds in the face of that kind of changing society and working together on the problem of how to live well, live God's beautiful life together. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's encouraging because you want to see the church wants to look different in the terms of it's got an identity, but it's anti-tribalism in that sense, right? Because tribalism is the thing in our cultural moment that's sort of shredding us, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm going to switch tack here a little bit because tribalism and Christian identity have sprung up a little bit around, the buzzwords of Christian nationalism and how that posits a vision of society going forward. I've been reading some articles that part of Christian nationalism's issue is that it hasn't read ecclesiology properly. It's not reading how the Old Testament and the New Testament operate and the tensions within that. What's your take on some of that tendency to try and totalize the church to the Venn diagram between church and state being a circle?
Yeah. I spent a bunch of time thinking about this over the last year as well. And I think that you're fundamentally right. The ecclesiology is at the core of this. I would step back a little bit because I think I kind of rushed into this with a whole bunch of thoughts, and I was kind of helpfully slowed down a little bit by people saying, hey, Christian nationalism tends to be a kind of term that covers a whole range of different kinds of things. So there are some people who would call themselves Christian nationalists, and what they mean by that is that Christians should be involved in public cultural and political engagement, and that they should be involved as Christians, and that's really all they mean about it. And that if you do that, that will have some kind of impact in the nation, and you might even live in a liberal democratic society that has been impacted by Christianity, and you might call that some sort of minimal Christian nationalism. On the other end of the spectrum, yeah, you've got people who more technically you might call theonomists, who believe in living under Old Testament biblical law, and that we should seek to move a society towards that. There are Protestant and Catholic versions of this. So the Catholic versions of it will be called kind of Catholic integralism. The Protestant versions kind of dominionism or Christian nationalism. if we're going to kind of take the more hard end of those spectrums, the sort of Catholic integralism and the Christian nationalism, then yeah, I think fundamentally it's a question about ecclesiology. What is the church? And it shades into some interesting questions about eschatology, like what is the future and how is God bringing that future about? From my perspective, the Catholic integralist kind of take on this is the one that's most coherent. I think Christian nationalists kind of just wish that they were Catholic integralists, but they don't actually have the Catholic doctrine of the church. And it makes the whole thing, from my perspective, utterly incoherent. I do not understand how you can get a kind of Presbyterian Christian nation off the ground, given the kind of structure of what you think the Presbyterian church is, because that kind of view relies on the church being able to speak with some kind of authoritative voice to the political system, I think. And it's very hard in those kind of ecclesiologies to work out how the church as an institution can have that kind of authoritative voice within the theology of the Baptist church or the Presbyterian church. It's less hard to see how you do that in the Catholic church because the institutional church just is the church.
It's the monolithic nature of it that I've noticed that seems to make more sense of it. And then I'd have to say church history doesn't bear out Christian nationalism very well over the last 500 or 600 years as I've grappled with that. I read a great description of Christian nationalism. It's kind of on a dimmer switch on a light. It goes from very bright to, well, maybe you just described it there, the difference between I want a public square engagement as a Christian that gives me a framework, and down to we want to ride the boundary of the nation. And I think when you have to ride the boundary of the nation, there's all sorts of things going to pop up that you haven't envisaged.
Yeah, absolutely. And the basic a full-throated Catholic integralist, and I think a lot of Christian nationalists kind of want to be this, will say that that church discipline extends to anyone who can be identified as a Christian within the society, and may also extend to excluding anyone who isn't a Christian from the society to some extent. So, a Catholic integralist, a serious one, will look at me as a baptized Christian and will say, you are now under the authority of the Catholic Church as effectively, in some ways, an apostate, and you should be disciplined for that. You should experience some kind of hardship in order to bring you back to the true faith. And I think, again, if they're clear-eyed, they'll say that quite firmly.
Yes.
And my two problems with that, one, there's a ecclesiological problem. I do not respect your claim about the authority of the church that you're making there, and I find it hard to see how any Protestant church could claim that kind of authority over the consciences of other people. The second one is, the reason that we have the political arrangements that we have is because we used to have those ones, and they were really bad.
They didn't count for
I
us.
do not want to go back there.
No, it didn't count for me. I think if we want to put it down to that, it's and I don't want to be trite about it, but I watch movies like The Village, and I go, oh, that's what it ends up like.
Yeah, right. And fundamentally to all this, I was really struck actually. Even just a few months ago, I was reading again some stuff by Reinhold Niebuhr, who's one of the giants of political theology of the 20th century. And his whole political theology is actually founded on a really deep belief in original sin, and that sin affects every kind of human endeavor. And I actually think that's what happened a little bit on that sort of new right Christian nationalist, is that they've actually lost touch a little bit with the doctrine of original sin and of the radical nature of sin. And they've become, I think this is slightly ironic because this is what they accuse the left of all the time. They've become a little bit utopian.
That's what I used yesterday with someone talking about it. I felt like the progressive framework of utopia was just flipped into a conservative view of utopia, and utopian ideals always seem to break a few eggs to never arrive there.
Yeah, that's right. And they always fail on the radical nature of human sinfulness. And interestingly, the kind of political arrangements that we've by and large come up with are based on a really deep belief about the nature of human sinfulness and the need to mitigate its effects in social structures.
Even the early fathers of the Constitution of the US had baked that in, despite their ropey theological frameworks. They had guardrails up, I suppose. Hey, look, that's a good segue conversation, because I think it's interesting, and it's going to roll out a little bit more in the next few years, and maybe a Kategoria is going to deal with it. If people want to sign up to Kategoria, what should they do, Dan?
Yeah, kategoria.org.au is the website. Go through there. There's an application process. You can find out more about the events and the speakers through the website. Yeah, so kategoria.org.au. It's not far off. It's coming up at the end of September. So if you're interested, get onto it now, and we'd love to see you there.
I think it'll be great, Dan, and I think it's an increasingly important event given where we are in our roller coaster culture. So thanks very much for chatting to us today about it, Dan.
Thanks, Steve.